Happy Monday and happy last day of August. I hope everyone's doing fantastically well today. Welcome to the Hudson Eye and the Hot Topics series. My name is Jonah Bouquer and I co-founded the Hudson Eye. I am overjoyed to extend this welcome to you today. The Hot Topics is a humanities series curated locally in Hudson, New York, with a broader focus on the Hudson Valley and issues of global common concern. I'm here to say thank you and extend the warmest welcome from Hudson Hall, whom we thank for anchoring our program. We have a really special one for you today, and thanks for joining. I'd like to thank a couple of funders, which are Humanities New York, who have helped us with this series, to the J.M. Kaplan Fund and the Fund for Columbia County, to the Anonymous Angel Match, which stimulates local giving annually for the Hudson Eye, again to Hudson Hall, and also to the Hudson Tourism Board and the Common Council of Hudson. Over to Erin Levi Garvey, the mastermind and the curator of the Hudson Eye. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jonah. Welcome, everyone. Today's Hot Topics panel is about art history in the Hudson Valley region. This is something that's near and dear to me as a native and have grown up in the Hudson Valley and spent most of my life here in and out of the region. This is something that, I remember fondly taking school trips to Olana and Thomas Cole and, just bopping around the region with my family and begging them to take me to different museums and things. So today's Hot Topic panel is organized by Dr. Will Coleman. He is the Olana Partnerships Director of Collections and Exhibitions. He oversees a 90,000 object collection at the heart of the Olana State Historic Site. He's previously the Associate Curator of American Art at the Newark Museum of Art, where he curated the exhibition Vantage Points, History and Politics of the American Landscape, and held teaching positions at Washington University in St. Louis and Berkeley, where he earned his Ph.D. in 2015 with a research specialty in the painter architects of the Hudson River School. He has held fellowships in the Smithsonian Institution and the National Endowments for the Humanities and has published a wide variety of scholarship on the 19th-century art, architecture, and music. I'd like to thank him for joining. All right, Will, over to you.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Thank all of you for attending today. I hope this will be a light and lively and very personal overview of the rich creative history of our region. I'm going to share my screen here and get into the, hopefully you're seeing that in full screen mode now. So you've heard a little bit in my own background, the biases I bring to these remarks, certainly 19th century history, but we'll hope to bring down these comments all the way to 2020 and this year's festival, which you see on the right. It's been a pleasure to play a role in this exciting addition to our region. There, getting my own hands dirty and getting at least one splinter tying on Soyak's breath flags installed on either side of the Hudson River Skywalk, the link that binds Olana State Historic Site, where I work, to the Thomas Cole National Historic Site just across the river, this historic linkage that defines our region, I would argue. So that's the present, and we'll come back to the present, but I'll start farther back in the misty past with a historic view of Hudson that I'll say a little bit more about in the future. That's a start here today. So I've been asked to speak for just 35 minutes. This will be a quick one, and one can only go into so much depth there. For that reason, it's mostly on the visual arts, painting, drawing, aqua tint in the case of the one on the left, and not sculpture. And there's a whole other story we could tell about the history of three-dimensional art in our region, Storm King and Art Oh My, certainly the history of the performing arts as well, but I'll focus on the visual. It's also important to note that there was a long history of creative practice in this region long before Europeans arrived. This is the historic homeland of the Muncie Stockbridge brand of the Lenape, and we're just beginning to learn more about the kind of art making that happened in the region before the story that I know best. So with that caveat, I'll turn to the earliest depictions of this region by people set. We'll try to broaden the lens there at the end, recognizing that there are many voices that are not included here, and many other creators are eager to learn more about in the future. This is one of the earliest depictions by a European of the Hudson Valley. Really interesting early part of a series called Scenographia Americana, which was made by British military officers, interestingly. 61 here, officer of the British Armed Forces who would later become governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and an important leader back in England who took a rather sympathetic line toward the colonists during the Revolutionary War, Thomas Pownall. So here he's given us a depiction of Hudson's River, of the entrance of what is called the Topan Sea, spelled T-O-P-A-N. Of course, we know that's the Topan Sea today. There's a sense that these landscape subjects were worthy of depiction not for beauty alone, but for strategic potential. So these militaries bring training in landscape draftsmanship that they acquired at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, where it is seen as a perfectly legitimate part of an art to study not just ballistics and troop formations, but drawing, specifically because it helps you to understand troops through a landscape, how to suppress a hostile population implicitly that would be sequestered in that relationship, in that land. So this series of views brings a very distinct lens. It's not about visual pleasure. It's not necessarily about awe at the wonder of this beautiful, we all know, not so far from the town of Hudson, but it is about the possibilities in a militaristic sense of this landscape. So that's where we begin. And there is a whole rich history here. I was fascinated to learn, as Aaron mentioned, teaching at WashU in St. Louis, where I had an international Singapore, performing his required national service in the Singaporean Armed Forces was required landscape draftsmanship still today. He showed me a drawing that he made, not you're thinking about sight lines and how to move over hills and vales. This is still apparently a skill that is taught in some military academies. Start there with a certain set of presumptions about the value of landscape and indeed the threats of landscape. A place where one can be hidden, where it's not possible to see all hostile adversaries, a landscape that would give birth to a revolution just 24 years in the future. So much more could be said about all that, but I'll leave it there. We come in the early 19th century to a different way of looking at landscape, and this is another really key for our region in particular, that image that I had on my title slide of Hudson, part of a series known as the Hudson River Portfolio, words there at the end, attributed to William Guy Wall, who was making the watercolors for these executed as prints in multiples, widely distributed. Prints like this one, a lovely view of Hudson, a region we know and love, are again not primarily driven by landscape beauty. The agenda of this project is made very clear by the text that accompanies it. There are polemical statements along with each of these prints that clarifies the kinds of resources that can be extracted from each view you're looking at. The possibilities for establishing mills, the improvements that have already happened in these landscapes, improvements being the word for roads, ways in which goods can be moved through these places and extracted from them. So the Hudson River Portfolio shines a light on our region at the beginning of the 19th century, but does so specifically from economic and industrial motives. This is another series one could go into in great carefully at the subjects that were selected for inclusion, thinking about the motivations for those subjects, and challenging our current look at landscape, that we are primarily motivated by beauty, peace, and plenty. Instead, in this period, we're coming out of a tradition. The natural world is both laden with risk and with threat, places where there were laden with associations of sin and evil, really. This notion of wilderness was not the positive one that we have here today. So when William Guy Wall approaches landscape, he selects the cleared places, the open places where you can see without anybody hiding what's possible in this place. There's much that has been written about this slow transition in the European aesthetic world from wilderness as evil, as a path to sin, where not all can be seen clearly, where there's darkness and mystery, to a romantic notion of natural world unmediated by man as a place for contact with the divine. So William Guy Wall, I would argue, is right on the threshold between these worlds. And he's particularly bringing this kind of mercantile, utilitarian view to the landscape. Nevertheless, despite his set of preoccupations and presumptions, when he does bring together this collection of views from the source of the Hudson River way up in the Adirondacks all the way down to New York City, helping other newcomers to understand the possibilities of this place also in an artistic sense. And one of those newcomers is inevitably Thomas Cole. Us know this name well already. We have our wonderful Thomas Cole National Historic Site in Catskill, a collaborator in our humble country festival this year across the Skywalk. There are a lot of cliches and received wisdom that surround the legend of Thomas Cole as the so-called father of the Hudson River School. A lot of myth making, a lot of storytelling, but what we know is that in the latter part this young, ambitious artist who had from the north of England as a young man, fleeing his family's, moving around the young country from Pennsylvania into Ohio, trying to make a go of it in this new country and to get a fresh start. He is aspiring not to a rewarding and remunerative career as a lawyer or something, but he's aspiring to be a professional and not a portrait painter or something relatively steady like that in this early country, but rather a landscape painter, which was a very unusual thing to be in this period. So Thomas Cole's value to this history is the argument his life makes that there is a place for a professional practice of landscape in this very young country that was preoccupied with the mercantile and the utilitarian values that we saw in William Guy Wall's Hudson River Report, and spent his whole life struggling and perhaps not fully succeeding to elevate the tone, to elevate, to build a market where there had been practically none for paintings that were primarily about the contemplation of unmediated nature, rather than about the resource value of landscape, rather than about the strategic or military value of landscape. So it's a grainy image, but it's an important one. At left is a view from that very first trip up the Hudson River in 1825, a view over the top of Catter's Falls, a subject that was already canonical, already famous as worthy of depiction, and was starting to have a pictorial history of its own with the efforts in the direction of landscape art. Cole here gives a really unusual view of it, just hinting at the precipitous drop off to the right, working it up in this painting you see on the right side of the screen here now in the Detroit Institute of Arts. He's taking some license with this. He supplies a perfect buck there that we imagine was probably not standing right at the edge of this terrifying waterfall, but helps to complete the picture. This is a very young artist, still realizing capabilities, giving us a vision of a landscape that was new to art. And this is a problematic view. This is obviously a view of the time that is not our own. We know that there was a long history of native inhabitation of these places. We know that already by Thomas Cole's lifetime, Catterskill Falls tourist attraction that was heavily mediated, even having buildings at the top of it that would turn on the water on request. So this was not pure wilderness. The value he's coming with is precisely the opposite of that of William Guy Wall. He is creating wilderness where there was already industry, civilization, a bustling tourist trade. So he's excising those human improvements from this landscape, even at the very beginning of his career. Thomas Cole's story is a very interesting one, just one of these foundational stories of our region. The through lines are artists coming from the city to the country for natural resources, broadly defined. Those natural resources might be for market commodities. Those natural resources might be for beautiful paintings. But the fact that this is America's first great wilderness, closely, readily accessible then as it is now from Manhattan, gives it this particular importance to the burgeoning art world of the States. Thomas Cole, although he never quite builds the fortune he dreams of and has big dreams, big ambitions, makes some very important allegorical cycles, voyage of life, the course of empire that you may be familiar with, well worth discussing, and we could talk about them in the questions if you like. He is always struggling, and it's in that context that he agrees to take on a particular student who leads our story forward a bit. And again, into the biases that I have admitted at the start, Frederick Church, the builder of Olana, where I am employed. I'll say plenty about Olana today, but I do think it's the story in our region. At left, a grainy image, apologies, of an early drawing Frederick Church makes when he comes to Catskill to study in that house you see on the right with Thomas Cole, 2 years, 1844 to 1846, to learn all that he could from one of the early professional painters of landscape art in this country. And it is on a sketching expedition with Thomas Cole that Frederick Church first goes to the site of what is now Olana. Olana's 250 acres, a full concept realized over many decades, began here in 1845, I think it is, where he stands on the form we call Red Hill, which was then largely clear cut with a nice view out toward the Catskills. Now it's pretty well overgrown behind the quarry you may see on the right when you enter the grounds of Olana. And we see a lifelong love affair beginning. We see the purpose of this landscape, that it is a perch from which to survey the river and the mountains beyond. He looks back westward in the direction of Catskill, that heart of the American landscape Thomas Cole began, and he looks back indeed to this building on the right where he had studied with Cole, where he was still studying with Cole. On the right is a drawing of 1848, sadly after Thomas Cole's premature death, and Frederick Church returns to this site and makes a kind of memorial drawing where he reflects on this site where he had studied, where he had learned so much, where he had built a career as the most financially successful landscape century, fully realizing the ambitions of his teacher, both in painting and in building. And part of the reason why I think this image is so important, I hope you can hear, is this structure at the right, which you probably know now stands at the Thomas Cole site again, thanks to the hard work of my colleagues over there, reconstructed, now a gallery space, formerly a practical painting room, that was Thomas Cole's only built structure on this site. And because Thomas Cole is establishing a history for our region of the dream of shaping three-dimensional landscape, not merely oil on canvas, but water, bricks and mortar. And Thomas Cole is not able to achieve much in this direction. He makes dozens and dozens of architectural drawings for a Italianate villa he hopes to build on this property. He passes on this ideal of the painter architect, not confined to this, but participating in the larger world through new buildings and gardening, shaping the earth. And Frederick Church carries those ideas forward as their rightful, I would argue. He brings those ideas to Olana. This remarkable work of three-dimensional landscape is another important part of the foundation of our region for all this wonderful creativity we're enjoying now in 2020 with this year's festival. So many major artists of the world choosing to set up a country place in our region, new arts institutions beginning. There is this model back in the 1860s, all the way through the time of Frederick Church's death in 1900, of progressively creating what you see here. Olana is not just a house on a hill that you may see when you cross the Rip Van Winkle Bridge. I hope that you've been up to the place and explored. If you have, you know that it's a much larger concept. We like this view by a child of Frederick Church, a kind of school project that gives you a sense of just how large this creation is. These sinuous paths that are not serving any practical purpose getting from point A to point B, but are about the pleasure of moving through constructed space, taking aesthetic from gradually revealed insights and views. We talk about this on our landscape tours. This is this survival of something that was a lot more common in our region. Part of this art history I'm talking about today is a number of artists who are setting up shop, making three-dimensional landscape, even as they're better known for paintings. Jasper Francis Cropsey, Albert Bierstadt, a number of other artists are making really interesting houses, doing gardening, and expanding their kind of principles of art into the natural world. And I would argue that's a precursor for sites like Art Omai and Storm King, these places that think on a vast scale. It's also a precursor for people like Robert Smithson and the world of land art, people who are making challenging conceptual projects using nature's own materials. That begins, I would argue, with a place. So you see the big picture here. I'll use my little cursor to point out that house on the hill, the main house as we refer it, just one of many structures. I'll give you some views of how this place was used to practice landscape, the lessons learned from Thomas Cole in our region. We have this notion of a school, which is a widely understood term that is not without its problems, a rather loose group of artists, both male and female, many different places, painting all over the world, not just the Hudson Valley, but starting here with a certain set of values, valuing nature for its aesthetic as well as sometimes its mercantile properties. People who found a happy union with the railroad industry and with the spread of industry through these places. People who were taking Thomas Cole's skepticism of what he called the ravages of the axe and were then selling paint railroad tycoons and the magnates of the timber industry, people who valued having depictions of the landscapes they owned. There's an uncomfortable history here by mid-century, getting into the middle of the 19th century now on the verge of the Civil War, of looking to other kind of possibility, its marketability to new fortunes of a new country. These paintings are market economy. These are part of Olana's vast collection, a tremendously important American art museum, among so many other histories in the place, of personal paintings, paintings that Frederick Church made of the view from his own property, the place that his hard work and talent had won him, with his family, enjoying the views set over the Hudson River. An exception here is the one at center, view of the Catskills from the artist's home. This one was sold. Participate in the large, but intriguingly, it's one of just two paintings I know of that Frederick Church later repurchased. He wanted it back. It belonged at Olana. It was a part of that personal story of this region we all know and love and see the creative possibilities of, that he wants to have back in that home. And you can see it in our interiors today. Just as soon as we get it, we're working on that. I want to show you also that the main house was a subject in landscape. I like to think of the here as a house for landscape. This is one of those ways. It's a house for landscape. It's meant to be seen from the river below, from the grounds of Olana. Dual revelation as you move through this place. It's meant to intrigue and delight, fascinate from afar. It's a place that frames your experience of land. There's also an inherited value from Thomas Cole and others that through a well-constructed building, you are allowed privileged access to nature. And one of the ways you see that is through these series of spaces that left here, Frederick Church's own drawing for that iconic building, already including these spaces I'm pointing to that we call outdoor rooms, the piazza, the ombra, the bell tower, places that are in the house, but not separated from the landscape outside by walls, that open to it, that allow you to embrace the natural world even while you're sheltered from the rain. One of the characteristic features of this building that he had learned from the houses with where our thoughts are now, really a hard time in Beirut these days, but a city that he loved. And he was fascinated by the recesses in the characteristic architecture of that great city, and he wanted to follow that here. He called it a house that was Persian adapted to the it's vaguely Middle Eastern, everything and nothing, a hodgepodge that we sometimes call Orientalism. There's another movement that is referred to as American eclecticism. That is a good way of describing this house. But to get back to the core of matters here, it's a house that's also about experiencing representations of landscape spaces. So I'll give you a few tantalizing glimpses of these interiors, starting with the studio, a space within this house built on a painter's fortune from selling tremendously popular paintings that were publicity events, much talked about in their period. People like Mark Twain talking about their encounters with Frederick Church paintings, commanding massive celebrity and financial success like Thomas Cole could never dream of. And then this is that dream of a painter's studio, not spattered with paint, but by the accoutrements of global travels, inspiring your practice, and some examples of that practice with some of his own work here, as well as the work of others. We've been learning more about these great collections. At the heart, so many collections within the collection besides paintings, but I could talk your ear off about that another day. The studio there, a place made for the ideal environment for the art of the Hudson Valley. Another space here, the sitting room, a historic photo. We've changed the painting that hangs there now, but one of the collection, Petra, in Jordan, one of these early travels he made with his family to depict these subjects that were relatively new to painting, making these immersive environments where his paintings can be shown to best effect. It's a family home. It's a place for receiving distinguished visitors. Not least, it's also a place for looking out at and enjoying that landscape. I say all this about Olana because it is typical, because there were so many other places like it that have not survived. This was the ideal of the mid to late 19th century, inhabiting the landscape you love, shaping it through hard work and toil, making it a home with your family, and possibly even using it as a place from which to build your own artistic reputation and sell some paintings from time to time. I'll point out to you one you've seen before there. Is the view of the Catskills from the artist's home. Not least, we can't leave the interiors of Olana without looking at the ornate court hall. Patterns and colors designed by the artist using pattern books, sources from the Arabic world, an affectionate tribute that doesn't always square perfectly with our current values. It's treating this vast, complex region, many different cultures and peoples as a kind of a single culture that can be drawn on as Persian adapted to the Occident. So we're trying to tell these diverse stories of global collections to audiences that demand particular rigor. It is certainly an affectionate tribute. It's a place that's full of fascinating discoveries, and a real privilege to work there. I mentioned that the story of the Hudson history of our region is not all about men, and this account would not be complete without stopping on Eliza Greatorex, who also is useful to us as a way to broaden outward toward another prehistory of the Hudson Eye Festival, a prehistory of all the creative ferment of the city of Hudson in 2020, which is art movements. I've been thinking recently about the ways in which the Hudson River School is a kind of art colony. When we talk about art colonies, we mean a group consciously gathering in a particular discrete patch of earth to work together collaboratively and to develop their process, focusing on topography, particular landscape subject matter. So famous examples are the Impressionists at Giverny, the Barbizon School in the forest of Fontainebleau. In this country, the Monhegan Island colony, one that's very near and dear to my heart, the Coscob colony in Connecticut, and the Cragsmore colony in our region. I hope you'll all get a chance to visit this still fascinating village in the Catskills with all kinds of rich art history. And there are some local boosters who are doing that story today. Eliza Greatorex is one of these pioneers. It was a very difficult thing to be a professional female artist in the mid to late 19th century. Her life is coincident with that of Frederick Church, but a much less well-known name that deserves to be better known. She had a really interesting international career. She made an important print series as well as paintings like the one you see on the right, a few near Cragsmore appropriately. And I know that one of our friends at Olana is about important new scholarly biography of Greater X. So we look forward to learning more about her in the future. So the Cragsmore colony is one of these first colony movements, are choosing to gather in a particular place and focusing on its subject matter. Another is Woodstock. So I'm turning now into the 20th century, getting to the end of my time. I want to start broadening back out, and I will return to the way Olana is still a part of the contemporary story today. Woodstock, I know already, is another really important prehistory for the vibrancy of Hudson today. Here, a painting by George Bellows, My Picket Fence, a view of his own, which has recently been made a historic site. I believe that's Overlook Mountain in the background, so a scenery that's familiar to many of us. Woodstock is many different layers of art history, a fascinating town in its own right. Bellows is my particular passion within this group, so I start there. The painter who's better known for his brutal boxing paintings, but tremendously important talent of the 20th century, versatile, prodigious talent, fascinating life, drafted by the Cincinnati Reds to play professional baseball, but gave it all up to go pro as an artist. Really interesting story, and it's our story in our region. You can still visit at the Woodstock School of Art, the printing press he used there. So there are these really clear connections that go all the way back to this turn of the 20th century moment. We also have the history of the Art Students League, part of what brought Bellows to the region. The Art Students League of New York City setting up its in Woodstock, which brought many major 20th century artists to Woodstock. And then simultaneously, you have the Birdcliff Guild, most associated with ceramic practice, but also making history, still hosting important artist residencies to this day. And that's another turn of the 20th century foundation, kind of crafts movement, another proud legacy of our region. I'll jump forward a little bit to another history of our region, Ellsworth Kelly's studio in New York, the late lamented Ellsworth Kelly. And this is that building from the outside and a view inside that studio of a rather different kind of creative practice, not necessarily depicting the landscape outside his windows, but also responding to the natural beauty of this region, showing us the range that artists have set down roots in this place we love and found space to spread out, that the affordability of our region is part of the beauty of its nature, of its light, and to make these vast creative spaces where you can build an ambitious series of paintings like this one, Ellsworth Kelly, and another important region. This will be a rather surprising change. Another thing that doesn't look quite like a landscape painting, but believe it or not, this is another story of our region and another story of Olana. Tie a bow on the end of my remarks here. I think I'm getting close to time. The work of Jeffrey Gibson, who has a studio in Claverack, really of indigenous heritage, who is offering the Technicolor, wry, often humorous account of a kind of perspective on the concerns of the contemporary art world, often laden with climate justice and environmental concerns, as is the case in this work known as this ornate and beautiful quilt, which refers to some of his characteristic forms, like the jingle beads of a powwow dancer arrayed on a figure, will be displayed at Olana in 2021. This is a really exciting part of our upcoming exhibition, Cross-Pollination, Our Contemporary Moment, which was supposed to be open right now. So luckily we were able to postpone it undiminished to next year, by which time we're confident that safety procedures and public health circumstances will allow us to make this fully available to the public. It's a really rich project that brings together a bunch of 19th century work that shows close scientific study of the natural world, including its threats that were already present in the natural world, down to the present day. Other artists who are also closely observing the natural world, its rhythms, its challenges and threats. This is a wonderful case project. Olana has been embracing the contemporary more and more, and this is one of those key moments that you may be aware of, the Jesus Rafael Soto sculpture, Penetrable. on loan from the collection of Patricia Phelps Cisneros from 2015 to 2017 in the grounds of Olana. This was very popular artwork, very Instagram worthy, much discussed, and it's a moment that we were very proud of. This is something that we'll hope to do more of, referring to former buildings that we know stood in the landscape of Olana, in this case, the summer house, and activating that site with so exhibition we're building towards is part of a longer history. Another of these proud stories of displaying contemporary art at Olana was the 2015 show that River Crossings. And this shows Martin Puryear's work in the court hall at Olana, that space you already saw. You'll also notice a Chuck Close tapestry hanging in the stair hall. Note that place because I'll refer to that as I conclude again. But really powerful juxtapositions. I've heard Martin Puryear was really taken aback and loved this placement because, as he said, he'd never seen his work on a carpet before. So there are virtues to these dense Victorian environments. So of collections and ideas, the stuff of a life well lived and well traveled, and it lends a new intricacy, a context to a sleek and maybe minimalist work like this curving wooden form. Cross-pollination, the show of originally 2020, now 2021, like River Crossings, is a collaboration with the Thomas Cole National Historic Site, these two institutions of our region that are deeply engaged with the rich 19th century story of the Valley, but also showing how it's still a place of creative valley, how this was always a place of challenging, creative, contemporary art with the work of Coleman Church, their families, their heirs, all the way down to the present. This show centers on a series of paintings known as the Gems of Brazil by Martin Johnson Heed. You'll be able to see that series in full, divided between the Cole site and Olana. You'll have to go to both our institutions to see the whole series. These intimate, carefully studied images of hummingbirds in their settings in Brazil, and American artists going abroad, studying the natural world. We will bring in other ways these artists were studying the natural world as well. The egg collection of the church children, Downey Church on the right, a beautiful watercolor study of a flower. This intense engagement with the scientific realities of the natural world is the core theme here. I mentioned the Chuck Close tapestry work before. I'll give you another little exciting preview of cross-pollination. There's this story we're working on in the background at Olana of the piece we call the Nehanzu, this silk scroll work showing the death of the historical Japanese scroll that, as you can see, is in pretty rough condition from having been displayed out in the light and air for 150 years. So we can't display it in its out there anymore. But just as Jesus Soto's Penetrable just referred to a historic installation choice, so does Vic Muniz's White Orchid, Martin Johnson Heed, refer back to historic installations. And this is a prime example of how the contemporary art world is still responding to the work of breaking them down, deconstructing them, rebuilding them as collage, and then making a digital chromogenic print of that work. Brazilian artists bringing a really interesting inter-colonial perspective to that American artist going down to Brazil and taking what was useful to him. So can't wait to bring that perspective to Olana. Not least, an artist we know and love, many of us, on loan from a Hudson collector, very generously, will be standing in the studio at Olana, ornately flowers, beautifully engaged with the stuff of the natural world and using them to cloak and disguise a human figure. A really powerful counter the orchid studies of Martin Johnson Heed in the 19th century. So this hopefully shows that Olana is not just a part of the long of creativity in our region, but also of its future. We'll be very eager to go forward as a partner to the artists of Hudson and the Hudson gathers, so many of them. I was honored to get those hands dirty working with Felice Soyak's Breath Flags, and I'm excited to see what the future holds, collaborative partnership. And with that, we can turn to questions, if you like. Very eager to have a good open conversation here. I'm going to unshare my screen, and I believe I'm going to give everybody the permission to chip in with questions as you see fit. So I'm happy to discuss.
Yeah, Will, thank you. That was incredible, and yeah, that really kind of brings me back to a few things, taking field trips and then going through as an adult, and and being a curator myself, and a lot of reference and material that kind of I've always kept in mind. A lot of friends of mine like, well, you work in contemporary, why are you so fascinated by the Hudson Valley? And why? I was like, it translates. One thing that came to mind, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the other artists from outside the region that came here to create work for, brief and extended periods of time, like Duncanson and Heed, and then they went on to like take their inspirations out of the region and take the same practices that they were having, or the same inspirations that they were having from the Hudson Valley, such as Heed going down to Brazil, things like that. Some of the notable artists that have really passed through the region, taken a respite, and become inspired by.
Absolutely. I think you're pointing to something that has always been the case and is really important for us to keep in mind. You heard my hesitation in this brand name, the Hudson River School, because one of the many ways in which it's problematic is that so much of this is not about the Hudson River. What we see is a roughly contiguous group of artists who at the same rough moment, same period of days and decades, are deciding that there is a time for landscape in this young country. There's what's called a landscape boom, and there happens to be a certain confluence in our region. That's great, but there's a lot more to it than that. Starting with people like Coleman Church, we see artistic projects that may be rooted here, inspired by here, but are defined by painting in Sicily, defined in the Andes, the Arctic, far-flung parts of the world, even from those artists who are most rooted in our region. So thinking of them as part of a Hudson River School, limiting in some ways. Duncanson and Heed, too, connected to the art world of New York City, but choosing to go their own very original paths. Duncanson, an artist we have to mention as the pioneer as an African-American artist at the Hudson River School. Another thing that was very difficult to be in this period, when what there was of it was very welcoming to people who are not white and male. So Duncanson is a fascinating talent. The racial boundary is only one of many that he transcended. Geographic is another of his career in Ohio. I'm also fascinated by his transgression of another border, which is the northern US one, all this work he did in Canada. That is a very in this period. And I think that's a whole other story well worth telling. So Duncanson is a fascinating talent. He's certainly tied deeply to this history, well aware of and considered a follower of people like Coleman Church, who are tremendously famous by the time he's rising onto the scene, but going his own way. Heed makes this really unusual, even as he constantly has this lifeline back to Manhattan, back to Church, through this lively correspondence, this very close friendship that we can trace. He bases himself in St. Augustine, of all places, which is not a bustling art scene then, and I don't know if it is even now, but it's an unusual place for an ambitious artist to go. So we're seeing these people who are certainly taking advantage of the ready accessibility of landscape subject matter here. A quick steamship ride in that period, just as there's a quick train ride in our period. They need from it, gaining some sustenance, maybe going to those already lovely resort hotels in a very civilized tourist landscape by the Catskill Mountain House, Laurel House, Overlook Mountain House. So many of these resort hotels that are specifically about making as comfortable and easy as your access to the natural world. So it's a place you can dip into and out of, and I think we do see that with contemporary artists. All these worlds talents like Mark Dion, Jeffrey Gibson, Portia Munson, Rachel Sussman, I know just set up a place in Woodstock. So many interesting people in a variety of media to dip into our region, to refill the reservoir, as it were, even as they go off to shows in museums and galleries all over the world.
Thank you. I mean, to your point, I think that is something that has been happening well before and during and beyond for artists to come here and really take on the inspiration of the region, or just being refreshed into, as you said, to refill the reservoir. I grew up in the Catskills a majority of my life, and I'm still coming here to work and do a lot of creative things, and have maintained our household here. I really
see a key part of this year's festival. You have a much better bird's eye view than I do. I only know Felice's work, which I certainly see as relating to the mountains, these ideas prayer flags, the Catskills are a core part of that project. From your unique perspective on all this, do you see people still, even if they're not working in landscape art, being tied to the natural resources of our region, if that's the core theme here?
Sure. I mean, Tommy Coleman, for instance, a number of his sculptures that he created for this iteration, he went into the woods, worked with a mill, he cut down a tree, milled the wood himself, and then created the sculptures out of it. So he was actually becoming one with his materials, sourcing it himself, and then creating these sculptures on his own, working upstate. I think he was in Bern, was where he had sourced his mill work. I mean, he's not a traditional mill worker, so it was a first for him. So he was taking the opportunity to work within a mill and understand how to take a tree, you know, and work with every element of it. You know, he's grinding the leaves and using that for pulping. It was wild. I mean, but then he's also engaging with the landscape as a whole as well, because he's created, one of his sculptures is at the point on Promenade Hill where you overlook the river and you take a respite, and it's an interactive sculpture. So I think both utilizing the materials and understanding the placement of the materials as well. We do have a couple of panelists and attendees that have questions. So what we're going to do is open up everyone, upgrade them to all panelists, and then we can have everyone face to face and we can really have a community discussion. So just one moment.
Familiar names in here.
Yeah, everybody should be getting access here. And you can feel free to put your video on or just raise your hand in the raise hand feature in Zoom, and we'll call on you and we'll start the discussion. Jonah, you have a question.
Well, just to be a bit of an icebreaker, right? I know that this normal humanities series at Hudson Hall, whom we wish to thank again, normally it's in person in the West Room and very animated. One can make eye contact and really dialogue with Dr. Will Coleman. We hope maybe next year that will be possible after all of this, but just to make a bridge, right? I hope that for those who are attending this amazing series or who might be starting their Monday and multitasking and whatnot, I wanted to mention, yes, Erin, thank you for the shout out to Tommy Coleman, but the artist is actually on the call, Feliz Soyak. And just to sort of underscore the fact that the Olana partnership, where Dr. Will Coleman has this very august role, acts as a bridge between the Thomas Cole site and the Olana partnership. And the Skywalk plays a huge role in the landscape of that, the very urban landscape. And Feliz has animated the two with her breath flags. So could we start there, perhaps?
Yeah, I appreciate you giving that opening. The Skywalk is a relatively new effort for us, and it gives me a chance also to clarify the obvious from the outside, the way Olana itself works. So I'm employed by the private nonprofit, the Olana Partnership, that was responsible for saving Olana back. Now it is a New York State park. So we work in support of the New York State park system. We work closely with the state government in caring for this rich historic site. And similarly, we're getting pretty good at government relations in this line of work. We work closely with the New York Bridge Authority, which oversees the Rip and Winkle Bridge, where we new, better signed, better lit, safer, wider pedestrian path across a pre-existing bridge that we call the Hudson River Skywalk, rather grandiosely, and trying a little bit on the massive success of the walkway across the Hudson down there in Poughkeepsie, a little bit of that and energy. And it's been great to see families out fresh air in a strange year, taking a walk across the bridge, but it had never really been activated with contemporary art before. So with a productive from Erin and Feliz and the Hudson Eye group, we have now made the first ever activation in that place, and this hopefully paves the way, getting our Bridge Authority comfortable with projects like this one for future projects. So Felice Soyak has installed both sides of the bridge these beautiful, delicate, diaphanous breath flags that each of them launch a good wish in a hard year submitted by a member of the public off to the winds. And we can all participate in that project through Felice's website, felicesoyak.com/breathflags2020, if memory serves. So it's a pleasure to be a part of that.
And that's it's a special project, and I know, Felice's work is absolutely monumental, and it also is, to your point, is not necessarily working with landscape or depicting landscape, but it's activating landscape, and it's a participatory installation. I think that's one of the most important things, because we are all isolated this year, and it's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily COVID inspired or directly a part of COVID, because this was a concept that she had been working on prior to this. But it is something that is getting people out of their homes. It's getting people to interact in a capacity that, they can still feel part of a community. Like, we're having a community discussion now. She's creating a community discussion through this body of work. And then people are able to then see it installed in person. And it is a monumental undertaking. And it is, it's traversing the land. It's also taking a leisurely walk, but it's also inspiring. So when you're reading each of these wishes and you're engaging with it as you're walking through landscape, it's a phenomenal installation. And for her to be the kickoff and the very first one, yeah, I think she's the perfect artist to be the first one.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? Philip?
Yeah, Will, what was happening with Olana before the renovation? Between after Church's death until the renovation started?
And everyone should be aware that we have a very interesting contemporary landscape painter here on our hands who's a regular correspondent. You can see some of Phil's work there in the background, and I know he has a very personal and direct with all this history we're talking about today. So the story of Olana down to its preservation history, I didn't understand the question at first, because so little restoration needed to be done. It was so carefully cared for. Freddie Church dies 1900. It continues as a family home that is carefully watched over already, all the way until the last heir dies in 65, I believe. So there wasn't much that needed to be touched point, but there was a frantic preservation effort. The family loved this place and cared for it well, but there was no logical way to divide the estate, and they corner where it was going to have to be sold. So the famous tableau we always paint here is literally every single object in the collection by Sotheby's for sale. It was going to be dispersed. This collection that I have the privilege of working with, hundreds of tremendously important paintings that are just the tip of an iceberg. That is also a major collection of Mexican textiles, a major collection of Italian ceramics. There's the most recent discovery has been an astonishing collection of thousands of pioneering 19th century photographs that nobody knows about. And this has to be a future exhibition, but like, name your major 19th century photographer, Watkins, Charles Bierstadt, brother of Albert. You just go down the list, Timothy O'Sullivan. It's in the collection. There are these amazing things that nobody's seen. All those would have been sold off, dispersed to the earth, if not for this work of one art history professor at Smith College. I see my colleague Allegra, who's a proud alumna of Smith, on the call here. We have a lot of David Huntington, the first dissertation about Frederick Church, got to know Olana before it was saved, before it was open to the public, decided this would be too great a loss. This article in Life magazine, Must This House Be Destroyed? And creates Olana Preservation Inc. that raises half the cost and saving the place. And then Governor Rockefeller comes up with the other half, makes it a New York State park. So there's always been this public-private partnership that continues today. It's a really productive example. And it was just a matter of, I guess, putting up a few ropes here and there, make sure people don't sneak off with any of the ceramics, but it was largely ready to go as a historical changed ownership. Any other questions? Discuss.
Well, I was wondering if you could talk, you've just given us, I mean, a keynote of the ages. We want to express our appreciation, not to mention, the mastermind that Will is and that Aaron is. Um, how do you think about giving us a little bit of insight into curating for those of us who may be, who may be interested, who may be artists, who may wish for inroads into that? How do you think about the history praxis versus the landscape praxis versus the contemporary art praxis, where you and Aaron are actually in a position to create a different kind of bridge, maybe,
Mhm.
between the kind of art that Feliz makes? I don't know, or is it three, right? Is it three different curatorial areas of expertise?
Mhm. That's a very interesting and a big question. I'll be interested to hear Aaron's thoughts as well. It's a pretty strange profession and a word, this word curator, that has gotten to be watered down in an age curators of social media feeds and all these things. What it means to me and the path I've taken through it has been about the work first and foremost, starting from history. And there are many different ways to start from this. So for me, it always began from the 19th century stuff, landscape in particular, recognizing always that a key and inextricable part of that was a time when these things were new and challenging and contemporary and not expected and easy to make. And that offers an obvious opening to bring in the contemporary. Candidly, when you are a historic, when you're starting from a background in 19th century work and you're practicing this profession in 2020, one feels a powerful impulse from the general public toward the contemporary. Salutary. There is a massive demand for making these stories relevant to contemporary audiences, bringing in the stories of how new artists are responding to the same. So that is necessarily a part of the job, even if you do fancy yourself a historian first and foremost. So I've come to that at this point in my career with less of a background in it. It's been very interesting to learn from colleagues who do have a deeper grounding in working with living art. Aaron, so I'd be curious to hear about your path through all this.
Yeah, I mean, I come from the same place that you do and the same thoughts that you do about it. I think it is kind of becoming a little bit of a watered down term as opposed to what it was founded on. And what I look at it as is being a steward and stewarding work and stewarding artists. I've been fortunate enough to work with a lot of living artists, and I find that to be very interesting because then kind of down the line, what I'm able to do is steward their legacies beyond. So what I'm primarily inspired by or primarily focusing on is the ability to archive and know their legacies while they are living, because I'm taking inspiration from art history that I was inspired by as a child and through grad and undergrad, and through all of my schooling and teaching and whatnot. I think, often in lectures, when I'm able to travel around and give lectures, I always start off with everything was contemporary at one point in time. So I'll often talk about the Lascaux cave paintings compared to Andy Warhol's cow wallpaper, and I see them as being one and the same. I think that there's ways to tie in the historic with the contemporary on a number of levels. I think the intersections are constant. And I think history is always informing the present, and the present is always looking back to the history. And we're always having this conversation of how do we make the future better, and how do we look to the future, and how do we make a better place for everyone and these artists as a whole. So yeah, I see it as like a legacy building, legacy sustaining, memory sustaining kind of things. That's where most of my inspiration comes from, to try and preservation, and it's all stewardship in my mind. Curatorial work is stewardship.
Exactly. And for example, we have a couple of other questions too, including from, I think, Elise, who's more on the education front, which is very very dynamic. And that question, right, is whether you attended yesterday the Curating Hudson series, followed and curated by Erin, now over to Will, who's a curator by trade. Is everyone a curator, right? You could almost expand the argument in either way. Elise, can we just make space for you, maybe more on the education front? This series is also funded by Humanities New York.
Sounds like it may be a comment as much as a question, but I see we have a high school art teacher in our midst who has been bringing students to these places for many years. Glad to have you here. If you do have any questions for those students, very glad. That's just a comment there. It's okay. Well, thank you for chipping in. Sorry to put you on the spot there, but all good, and glad that you found these places useful to your students. I hope that you will students during this really exciting, like once in 5 years, really major push to bring a lot of exciting contemporary art to Olana, opening June 12th.
And I can attest to, as a young student that came to Olana as a child in elementary school and in high school and things, kind of how it inspired me to take on this role as a professional. I did see that Feliz has rejoined the conversation. I don't know if she wanted to make a comment or talk a little bit more about her installation. Hey Feliz, how are
We've
you?
been talking about you. Glad you could join.
Sorry, I'm in parent mode, so excuse
Okay.
the background noise.
Well, we were just singing your praises and saying nice things about you behind your back. I was confessing what a novel thing it was for me to get my hands dirty with a real living, inconveniently alive artist instead of a 19th century person.
Yeah, I'm glad you could participate. Appreciate your knot tying skills, so thank you.
But yeah, I just wanted to maybe, if you want to talk a little bit about the project and how it's ongoing, and you know, being an artist that's living here, creating work with an international focus and international voices collaborating in your project. Yeah, just
yeah, sure. Yeah, so just to give a little background, I've wanted to do a collaborative project for a while, and in a way do like a crowdsourced project. And when the pandemic hit, it just felt like the right time, and it just kind of happened organically. Just thinking about how can I connect with people as we're all, you know, sequestered at home, and how can I create something that furthers that connection and can give us hope in a time that feels very challenging for a lot of people. And so it was really born in April of this year, and then organically took shape, was generously funded by one of a grant from the Hudson Arts Emergency Program, and that kind of got it started. And yeah, I mean, to date, I've gotten almost 60 wishes from people all over the world, as young as age 4, all the way up, from Sweden, from Portugal, from all over the US. And I hope to keep growing it. But you know, for me to receive all these wishes, it's been really beautiful just to hear the positivity and the hopefulness that people have. And I think, you know, especially now, we're so inundated with negative media, because that sells. But art can really be a tool and a medium for hope, and a tool for connection. And this project has really shown me that it can do that. And yeah, the hope is that while it's local, we can keep collecting wishes, you know, from local visitors to the Skywalk, to Olana, to Thomas Cole, and from, you know, from international locations. I've been talking to a few people some who live in Sweden who are interested in doing like a satellite installation there, and another one in Portugal. So the goal is to keep this this project growing and going, and it feels like it's needed right now. And so I hope to just continue that as long as it feels right.
Thank you, Felice. That's great. Let's find some more places for it to go.
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, everyone. Well, if there's no more questions, I just want to thank everyone for attending. And we have another lecture panel tomorrow, and it'll be 1 p.m., different Zoom channel, but the same Zoom time. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you for joining us today. Tonight as well, we have 6:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. with Bill Stone at Tanya Grunert's Princess Beatrix House, and every day at 1 p.m. the Humanities series. Thank you for joining, and thank you, Dr. Will Coleman.